He removed everything that could identify them. The eyes, the ears, the fingertips, the teeth, every feature a police force in 1935 could have used to put a name to a body. He was a doctor, he knew exactly what to take. What he could not remove were the flies. 3 weeks later, an entomologist looked at the maggots feeding on what was left and told the police to within a few days when the remains had been put there. That date destroyed the only alibi the man had, and it came from insects that had arrived on their own. On the 29th of September 1935, a woman named Susan Johnson was walking across a bridge in the south of Scotland, a few miles north of the town of Moffat, when she looked over the parapet into the ravine below. The stream at the bottom is called the Gardenholme Linn. It runs down through a steep, wooded cleft and joins the River Annan a short distance further on. It is the kind of place people pass without stopping. She stopped because something in the gully did not look like part of the landscape. What she had seen was a bundle. When the police came, they found more than one. Scattered along the banks of the stream and lodged in the undergrowth were parcels wrapped in newspaper, in cloth, in a bedsheet, in a pillowcase, in a child's rompers. Inside them were human remains. There were, in the end, something close to 70 separate pieces. They belonged to 2 people. That is where almost every account of this case begins, and it is the wrong place to begin, because the horror of the discovery is not what makes the case matter. What makes it matter is a question the police faced in the first week and could not answer with any tool then available to them. They did not know who these people were. They did not know when they had died. They did not know where they had died. And they were dealing with somebody who had thought about all 3 of those questions before them. Because the remains had not simply been dismembered, they had been edited. Whoever did this had removed, deliberately and with some skill, the specific parts of a human body by which a human body is identified. The fingertips were gone, the teeth had been taken out, the eyes had been removed, the ears and the nose had been cut away. So had a set of distinguishing features that only somebody who knew these 2 women would have thought to remove: a birthmark, a scar, the shape of a limb. This was not frenzy. Frenzy leaves a mess. This was a procedure carried out by somebody who understood anatomy well enough to take a body apart at the joints, and who understood forensic identification well enough to know exactly what a pathologist in 1935 would be looking for. And that is the part worth sitting with, because to understand why this case became one of the most important in the history of forensic science, you have to understand how thin the alternative was. In 1935, there was no DNA profiling. There would not be for 50 years. There was no national fingerprint database that could be searched in any practical way against an unknown body. There were no dental records held centrally. There was no genetic genealogy, no computerized anything. Identification of an unknown body rested on a short list: fingerprints, teeth, distinctive marks on the skin, and recognition by somebody who had known the person alive. Every single item on that list had been removed. So the man who did this had, on the evidence of the bundles themselves, succeeded. He had reduced 2 named women with families and jobs and histories into anonymous material. As far as the science of 1935 was concerned, he should have won. The reason he did not is the subject of this episode, and it is not the reason most people remember. The case is famous for one thing: a photograph, and the photograph was remarkable, and we will come to it. But the photograph identified the victims. It did not establish when they died, and without that, the identification would not have been enough, because the man in question had an account of the relevant week and no way of being contradicted. What contradicted him was insects. Specifically, it was the larvae of blowflies, recovered from the remains in the ravine and examined by a lecturer in a Glasgow laboratory who did something nobody had done in a British murder trial before. He looked at how far they had developed, and from that he calculated how long they had been there. That number destroyed the account, and it is the reason this case, more than any other, is where forensic entomology enters the story of criminal investigation. This episode is about that number, and about the men who worked out how to produce it, and about what it means that the thing which convicted a careful and intelligent killer was a form of evidence he could not have removed because it did not exist until after he had gone. Start with the problem as the police actually had it in the first days of October 1935. They had remains in a Scottish ravine. They had two individuals. The initial examination, carried out in Edinburgh, established the basics and immediately produced a difficulty, because the first reading of the remains suggested one body was male. That reading was wrong and it was corrected, but it tells you something about the state of the material and the confidence with which anything could be said about it. The pieces had been separated in a way that removed the most reliable indicators, and the assembly of them into two coherent individuals was itself a substantial piece of work. The team who did that work were among the best in Britain. Professor John Glaister of the University of Glasgow was one of the leading forensic scientists in the country. Professor James Cooper Brash of the University of Edinburgh was an anatomist. Between them, in a laboratory at Edinburgh, they set about reassembling two human beings from a heap of parts. It took months. They worked out that the remains were both female. They worked out approximate ages, approximate heights, approximate builds. They established that the dismemberment had been carried out with anatomical knowledge, which narrowed the field of possible perpetrators very considerably, because in 1935, the number of people who could take a body apart cleanly at the joints was small and mostly professional. The methods they used are worth describing, because they are the foundation of what is now called forensic anthropology, and in 1935 they were being assembled almost in real time. Sex was determined principally from the pelvis, which differs measurably between men and women in the width of the sciatic notch and the shape of the pubic region, and secondarily from the skull. Age was estimated from the state of the bones, the fusion of the growth plates at the ends of the long bones, which completes on a broadly known schedule through the teens and 20s, and the condition of the joint surfaces and the skull sutures thereafter. Height was calculated from the long bones themselves, using regression formulae that relate the length of a femur or a tibia to overall stature. None of these gives a precise answer. All of them give a range, and the ranges narrow when they are combined. Then there was the negative evidence, which in this case was unusually eloquent. The specific parts removed were not random. A person who removes fingertips is defending against fingerprints. A person who removes teeth is defending against dental comparison. A person who removes eyes, ears and nose is defending against recognition of a face. And a person who cuts away a particular patch of skin from a particular limb is defending against something much more specific, a mark that somebody who knew that woman would be able to name. The absences, in other words, formed a portrait of the killer's knowledge. Whoever did this understood exactly what identification consisted of in 1935, which is a short list, and a short list is worth setting out because it explains why he was so nearly right. There was fingerprinting, which Britain had used in criminal work since the turn of the century, and which by 1935 was well established, but which depended on having fingertips and on the person being already on file. There was dental comparison, which depended on teeth and on a dentist's records existing and being found. There was recognition, somebody looking at a face or a scar or a birthmark and saying a name. There was blood grouping, which had been discovered at the start of the century and could exclude but could not individualize. It could tell you that a stain was not from a given person far more usefully than it could tell you that it was. And there was measurement of the living body, the old Bertillon system, largely superseded by then. That is the whole toolkit. There was nothing else. No DNA, no databases in any modern sense, no imaging. Ruxton had addressed the first three directly and physically, and the fourth and fifth did not apply to a set of remains without a name. Against the science he knew, he had covered the board. But none of that produced a name. It produced a description of two women who could have been any two women. And a description is not an identification. You cannot charge somebody with the murder of an approximately 35-year-old female of medium build. The first genuine break came not from the bodies, but from what they were wrapped in. Among the wrappings were sheets of newspaper. Most of it was ordinary pages that could have come from anywhere. But one piece was not ordinary, and an officer who noticed it changed the case. It was a page from the Sunday Graphic, dated the 15th of September 1935. That in itself would have been useful, because it gave a date before which the remains could not have been deposited. But this particular page came from what the newspaper trade calls a slip edition. National papers in that period would print localized runs, with a page or two altered for a specific area, a regional story, a local advertisement. This edition carried a report of a local event, and it had been distributed only in and around Morecambe and Lancaster, in the northwest of England. The print run was small, something on the order of a few thousand copies. So the police now had a geographical anchor. Whoever had wrapped these remains had very probably been in possession of a newspaper that could only have been bought in one specific corner of Lancashire, a corner more than 100 miles from the ravine where the bundles were found. That is a genuine piece of detective work, and it is worth pausing on, because it is the kind of thing that only happens when somebody looks carefully at material that appears to be packaging rather than evidence. The newspaper was, to the man who used it, a wrapper. It was the thing around the evidence, not the evidence. He had removed fingertips and teeth and eyes, and then he had reached for whatever paper was in the house. Lancaster now mattered, and in Lancaster 2 women had been missing since the middle of September. Here the case narrows very quickly, so it is worth setting out the household properly. At 2 Dalton Square in Lancaster, there lived a doctor named Buck Ruxton. He had been born Bakhtiar Rustomji Ratanji Hakim in Bombay into a Parsi family. He had qualified in medicine in India, served briefly, come to Britain, and changed his name by deed poll. By 1935, he had a general practice in Lancaster, and by most accounts, a good one. This matters because the picture people tend to carry of a man capable of what happened in that house is not the picture Lancaster had. He was a working doctor with a substantial list of patients. He was well regarded by many of them. He was known in the town. He lived with a woman known as Isabella Ruxton. They were not formally married, though they lived as husband and wife, and she used his name. She had been born Isabella Kea in Scotland. They had 3 children. The relationship was not a calm one. There is a documented history of arguments, of accusations, and of police being called to the house more than once. Ruxton was, on the evidence that later emerged, intensely and persistently jealous, and convinced, without any substantiation that has ever been established, that Isabella was unfaithful. Also living in the house was Mary Jane Rogerson, aged 20, who worked there as a nursemaid and general help. She was from Morecambe, a few miles away, where her family lived. She had no part in any of the tension between the 2 adults in the house. She worked there. On the weekend of the 14th and 15th of September 1935, both women stopped being seen. The immediate background to that weekend is documented, and it matters because it supplies the thing every murder case needs and many lack, a reason for the timing. Isabella had gone to Blackpool. It was September, which in the northwest of England means the illuminations, and she had travelled there with her sisters to see them. She drove back late. Ruxton's conviction, and it appears to have been a conviction rather than a suspicion, was that she had been with a man. There is no evidence that she had. There did not need to be. The pattern of the previous years, recorded in the complaints and the interventions and the accounts of people who knew the household, was of a jealousy that did not require evidence and could not be relieved by its absence. What is inferred, and what Ruxton himself later described, is that the violence began that night. Mary Rogerson's position in this is the part that is hardest to read. She was 20 years old. She was a nursemaid in a house where 2 other adults had a relationship that had nothing to do with her. On the most probable reconstruction, she was killed because she was present, because she came out onto a landing or heard something or walked into a room. She is the reason the case has 2 victims rather than 1, and she is very often reduced, in the retelling, to the second body. Her family did not treat her that way. It was her family's persistence, more than anyone else's, that kept the questions alive in the days when the official position was that both women had simply gone away. What followed in that house over the next week is unusually well documented, because Buck Ruxton could not do it alone and had to involve other people. He engaged help to clean. He asked a woman named Mrs. Hampshire to come and scrub, and she did the stairs, the bath, the landing. He gave her carpets, he gave her a suit. The carpets were stained, so was the suit, and she later described trying to clean it. Think about what that means as a decision. A man who has just spent hours on the meticulous forensic problem of making two bodies unidentifiable then hands physical evidence as a gift to a woman from his own town and asks her to launder it. It is the same error as the newspaper. He was concentrating extremely hard on the bodies. The house was a different problem, and he treated it as housework rather than as evidence. He also had to explain himself continuously to patients, to neighbors, to his cleaner, to Mary Rogerson's family, and the explanations did not hold still. Isabella had gone to Edinburgh. Isabella had gone away with a man. Mary was pregnant, and Isabella had taken her away to see to it. Mary had gone with Isabella. He had cut his hand opening a tin of peaches, which is why there was blood. Each individual statement is unremarkable. The set of them, taken together and set against the calendar, is not. And then there is the driving. Between the 15th and the 17th of September, Ruxton made journeys north in his car, and it is those journeys that eventually placed him on the road to the Gardenholme Linn. He was not observed depositing anything. What happened was smaller and far more useful. On the way back in the early hours near Kendal in Westmoreland, his car was involved in an incident. A cyclist was knocked down. A police constable attended and took his particulars, as a constable does. It was, from the point of view of everybody present, a road traffic matter. That note put a named Lancaster doctor in a specific car on the road between Scotland and Lancashire, in the exact window that insect larvae would later independently identify. Nobody at the scene knew that. The constable was doing paperwork about a bicycle. What happened next is the part that most resembles ordinary detective work, and it is worth describing carefully because the science did not operate in a vacuum. It operated on a man who had already made a great many statements. Mary Rogerson's family expected her. She had arranged to visit them. She did not arrive. Her parents asked. Ruxton told them that Mary had gone away, that she was pregnant, and that Isabella had taken her away to deal with it. It was an account calculated to end the questions, because it was the kind of account that a family in 1935 might not wish to pursue. Her family pursued it. To others, Ruxton gave different accounts. Isabella had gone to Edinburgh. Isabella had gone away with another man. The stories did not agree with each other, and they did not agree over time. Meanwhile, at 2 Dalton Square, a certain amount of domestic activity had taken place that was difficult to explain. Carpets had been taken up, the stairs were stained. Ruxton had asked a series of people to help him clean and had given them explanations for the mess that shifted. He had been distributing carpets and clothing. He had had a fire in the yard. He engaged charwomen to scrub. He told one account of a cut hand, another of a spilled substance. None of these things individually proves anything. People clean houses, people have accidents. But the accumulation of them, in a house where 2 women had ceased to exist, was substantial. And there is one more element, and it is the strangest. Ruxton went to the police himself. He complained about rumors. He asked them to help stop people saying things about him. He drew official attention to his own household at a moment when the greatest possible service to his own interests would have been silence. That is a pattern that recurs in cases of this kind, and it is usually read as arrogance. It may be simpler than that. A man who has told a large number of people, a large number of incompatible stories, eventually has to do something about the fact that the stories are circulating. By the middle of October, the police had connected the Lancaster disappearances to the remains in the Scottish ravine, and Buck Ruxton had been arrested. But connection is not proof, and this is where the case would have failed in almost any earlier decade. Because Ruxton's position was not that he was innocent of some vague charge, his position rested on specific claims about specific days. Both women, he said, had left the house alive. He could describe the household after their departure. He had accounts of his own movements. To break that, the prosecution needed 2 things. They needed to prove that the remains in the ravine were Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson, and not two other women. And they needed to prove when those remains had been placed there, because if the deposit could be dated to the days immediately after the disappearance, then every one of Ruxton's explanations became worthless, and the small window in which he was demonstrably driving a car on the road north became the most important fact in the case. The identification was solved by anatomy, and it produced the image the case is remembered for. Glaister and Brash worked from the skulls. They had photographs of both women taken in life. And they did something that had not been done in this way before in a British court. They took a photograph of a skull, taken at the same angle and to the same scale, and superimposed it on the portrait photograph of the living woman. For Isabella, the fit was exact. The orbits, the jawline, the proportions of the cranium, the position of the teeth relative to the mouth, everything registered. It is a genuinely arresting piece of work, and it became one of the most reproduced images in the history of forensic science. It is also, by modern standards, a technique that would be treated with much more caution than it was in 1936, because superimposition can demonstrate consistency far more easily than it can demonstrate uniqueness. A skull that fits a photograph is compatible with that person. It is a weaker claim than a match in the modern sense. But there was a great deal more than the photograph. There was the reconstruction of two bodies whose measurements corresponded to two known women. There were features on the remains that corresponded to features the families described. There was a cast of a foot that fitted one of Mary Rogerson's shoes. Taken together, the identification was strong, and the prosecution had the newspaper which put the rapper in the right town. What they still did not have was the date. And this is where a man enters the case who is almost never named in the popular retellings. Dr. Alexander Meehan was a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, working in Glaister's department. His interest was in insects. When the remains had been recovered from the Gardenholme Linn, the material had included, as such material does, maggots. To almost every investigator in history up to that point, maggots on a body were a nuisance. They were part of the unpleasantness. They obscured the tissue you wanted to examine. Nobody had thought of them as a clock. Meehan did. The principle is simple to state and difficult to apply. When a body is exposed, blowflies find it very quickly, within minutes to hours in warm conditions if there is access. They lay eggs. The eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae feed and grow through a series of defined stages, called instars, and at each stage they can be recognized by size and structure. Then they leave to pupate and later emerge as adult flies. Crucially, the rate at which they pass through those stages is not random. It is governed principally by species and by temperature. A blowfly larva at a given temperature will take a broadly predictable time to reach the third instar. So if you can identify the species, and if you know the approximate temperatures over the relevant period, then the developmental stage of the oldest larvae on a body tells you, within a range, the minimum time since that body became available to flies. It is worth going a little further into the method, because the strength and the limits of the conclusion both come from the same place. The insects that matter here are blowflies, in Britain, principally the bluebottles Calliphora vicina and Calliphora vomitoria, and in warmer conditions the greenbottle Lucilia sericata. They are among the first organisms to find exposed remains, and they are extremely good at it. They locate a source by scent over considerable distances, and they arrive in suitable weather within hours. The female lays eggs in the moist openings, the mouth, the nose, the eyes, and any wound. The eggs hatch into larvae, and the larvae then pass through 3 defined growth stages, called instars, separated by molts. A first instar larva is a few millimeters long. A third instar larva is substantially larger, and its internal structures have developed in ways that can be identified under magnification. After feeding, the larvae leave the remains, wander, and pupate. The stages are not a matter of judgment, they are recognizable and the sequence is fixed. What varies is the speed, and it varies with 2 things above all, which species and how warm it is. Blowfly development is temperature-driven in a fairly direct way. A lava at 25 degrees will reach the third instar far faster than the same lava at 10. This is why modern forensic entomology does not work in days at all. It works in accumulated degree hours, the total thermal energy the insect has experienced, and reconstructs it from meteorological records for that specific location over the relevant period, then converts back into elapsed time. That refinement did not exist in 1935. What Meehan's had was a knowledge of the species, an understanding of their development, and the general conditions of a Scottish September, which is to say cool. Cool weather slows development, and slower development means a given stage represents more elapsed days. There is a further complication, and it is one a good modern practitioner would raise immediately: the remains were wrapped. Blowflies cannot lay eggs on material they cannot reach. Cloth, newspaper, and a bedsheet all delay access, not indefinitely, because wrappings are rarely sealed and the parcels had been disturbed in the gully, but the delay is real. The consequence is important, and it runs in the defendant's disfavor rather than his favor. If access was delayed, then the larvae are younger than the deposit. The insects give you the time since colonization, which is a minimum. The remains had been there at least that long, and possibly longer. So the honest form of the conclusion is not, these bodies were placed here 12 to 14 days ago. It is, these bodies have been available to flies for 12 to 14 days, and were therefore placed here at least that long ago, and no later. Meehan's identified the larvae and assessed their stage of development. He concluded that they had been developing for something in the order of 12 to 14 days. The remains were found on the 29th of September. 12 to 14 days before the 29th of September is the 15th to the 17th of September. Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson were last seen on the 14th and 15th of September. The newspaper wrapped around the remains was published on the 15th of September and sold only around Lancaster and Morecambe. 3 independent lines, the disappearance, the newspaper, and the insects, converged on the same 3 days. It is worth being precise about what that evidence did and did not establish, because this is a case where overstating the science is easy. The larvae did not prove that Buck Ruxton killed anybody, they did not identify the victims, they did not establish a cause of death. What they established was a window for deposition. They said, in effect, this material was placed in this ravine, exposed to flies on or about the middle of September, and not, as any defense would otherwise have been free to suggest, at some later date by some other person. That is the function of good forensic evidence. It closes doors, it does not on its own prove a case. It removes the alternatives that would otherwise keep a case open. And it did something else, which is why this specific piece of testimony has outlived the case. It demonstrated in front of a court that a form of evidence nobody had previously considered evidence could be made to yield a number. There is a longer history behind Meehan's calculation, and it deserves acknowledgement because the idea did not begin in Glasgow. In 13th century China, a manual of forensic investigation described a killing solved when an investigator instructed a group of men to lay their sickles on the ground. Flies gathered on one of them, drawn to traces invisible to the eye, and its owner confessed. Whether or not the account is literally true, it records an understanding that insects respond to things people cannot see. In France in the 19th century, physicians including Bergeret and later Magnin studied the succession of insect species that colonize remains over time, and Magnin published work setting out the idea that the arrival of different species follows a predictable order. The scientific foundations were laid decades before 1935. What had not happened was the application of that body of knowledge by a qualified expert to a specific set of remains in a criminal trial to produce a figure that a jury could weigh. That is what Meehan's did. And it is why this case is cited as the point at which forensic entomology stopped being a scientific curiosity and became an investigative tool. The trial opened at Manchester in March 1936 before Mr. Justice Singleton. Ruxton had been charged in relation to both deaths. The trial that determined his fate concerned Isabella. The prosecution case was built as a chain, and each link was of a different kind. The household evidence established that two women had ceased to exist in a specific house on a specific weekend, and that the man who lived there had given accounts of their departure that contradicted one another. The physical evidence in the house established that a great deal of cleaning had taken place urgently, and that explanations for it had shifted. The newspaper established that material from the Lancaster and Morecambe area had been used to wrap the remains. The anatomical evidence established that the remains were consistent, in a detailed and cumulative way, with Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson, and inconsistent with the proposition that they were anyone else. And the entomological evidence established that the deposit had occurred within days of the disappearance. There was also evidence of Ruxton's movements, including sightings of his car on the roads towards Scotland, and a collision in which his vehicle was involved in the north of England during the relevant period, which placed him on that route. The defense, conducted by Norman Burkitt, who was among the most formidable advocates of his generation, did what a competent defense had to do, and it is worth putting fairly. Burkitt attacked the identification. His argument was not absurd. The remains had been reduced precisely so that they could not be identified, and the prosecution was asking the jury to accept identification built from measurements, correspondences, and a photographic overlay. Superimposition was a new technique. It had never been tested in a British court. A jury was being invited to convict on the basis of a method with no track record. He attacked the inference from the household evidence, pointing out that a man may clean a house, burn refuse, and tell inconsistent stories about a domestic separation without being a murderer. And he had, in principle, the option of attacking the entomology, which was newer still. The difficulty was the convergence. Any one strand could be argued with. What could not be comfortably argued was why three independent forms of evidence, a newspaper's distribution area, the development of insect larvae, and the date two named women stopped being seen, should all point at the same few days by coincidence. The trial ran for 11 days, which for a murder trial in that period was long, and the length is itself informative. It was long because the scientific evidence had to be built in front of the jury from first principles. This is a point worth dwelling on because it is easy to imagine expert evidence as a moment. A witness says a thing, the courtroom reacts. It was not like that. Glaister and Brash had to explain how two bodies had been reassembled from roughly 70 pieces, what each measurement meant, why a particular bone indicated a particular age range, and why the correspondences they had found were unlikely to be coincidental. Meehan's had to explain what a blowfly does. Every one of those explanations was being offered to 12 people who had no reason to know any of it, by disciplines that had never been asked to do this before. Burkitt's cross-examination was, by the accounts of those present, formidable, and it went where any good advocate would go, at the joins. He pressed on whether the reconstruction was identification or merely compatibility. He pressed on the novelty of superimposition. He pressed on whether scientists who had worked on a case for months, knowing whose bodies the police believed these to be, could genuinely claim to have approached the material without expectation, which is a version of a criticism that forensic science has taken seriously only in the last few decades, and he was making it in 1936. Those were good questions. They did not succeed, and the reason they did not succeed is the convergence. The answers to them would have had to be wrong in the same direction, at the same time, as the newspaper and the insects and the calendar. Then Ruxton did the thing his counsel would almost certainly have preferred. He did not do. He gave evidence. A defendant is not obliged to, and a defendant with a case built on attacking the prosecution's science has very little to gain by it. What Ruxton had to offer was denial delivered with enormous emotion. He wept, he protested. He was, by every account of the courtroom, theatrical in a way that a jury in Manchester in 1936 was unlikely to find persuasive. The difficulty was not the emotion, it was that giving evidence meant being cross-examined on the statements, and the statements did not agree with one another. A man who has told his cleaner one thing, his patients another, the missing girl's parents a third, and the police a fourth cannot reconcile them in a witness box, because the inconsistency is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of record. The judge's summing up left the science to the jury as a question of weight rather than admissibility, which in itself was significant. Novel techniques had been allowed in, and the jury was invited to decide what they were worth. The jury took about an hour. Ruxton was convicted on the 13th of March 1936. He was executed at Strangeways Prison in Manchester on the 12th of May. There is a footnote to the verdict that says something about how the town saw him. A petition for reprieve was got up in Lancaster and attracted thousands of signatures. His patients, in substantial numbers, did not want him hanged. That is not a defense of him. It is a reminder that the man who did this was, to a great many people who dealt with him weekly, their doctor, and that the capacity to be both those things at once is not a contradiction that reality feels obliged to resolve. A document said to be his confession was published in a newspaper after his death. It described a killing that began in jealousy and a second killing that followed because a young woman had seen it. It should be read with the caution that any confession published for money deserves, but it is consistent with everything the physical evidence had already established, which is more than can be said for most such documents. What happened to the material of the case afterwards is worth a brief note, because it is unusual. Glaister and Brash published a full technical account of the medico-legal investigation. It was not written as a popular book. It was written as a record of method, how the remains were handled, what was measured, how the reconstruction was carried out, what the reasoning was at each step with the photographs. That book became a standard reference and remained one for decades, and it is the reason this case is not merely famous but genuinely instructive. The working was shown. That is rarer than it should be. A great many landmark investigations are known only through their outcome, and the actual technique is reconstructed later from fragments. Here the people who did the work sat down and wrote down how, while it was fresh, in a form other practitioners could use and check. The house at 2 Dalton Square in Lancaster is still there. It passed eventually into municipal use and people work in it. And the technique that Mearns brought into that courtroom went on to become an established discipline with textbooks, professional bodies, accreditation and standards of practice, one that is now routinely used to establish minimum post-mortem interval in cases where no other method can, and one that is careful now to say minimum every time. It is worth being careful about what followed, because the case had consequences in 2 directions. For forensic science, it was a landmark, and it was treated as one immediately. Glaister and Brash published a full account of the medico-legal work, which became a standard text. The reconstruction of the bodies is still taught. The superimposition photographs are still reproduced. And the entomological evidence created a precedent. It established that an expert could stand in a witness box, describe the development of insect larvae, and offer a court a figure for elapsed time. The discipline that grew from that has become considerably more rigorous and considerably more careful about its own limits. Modern forensic entomology does not simply look at larvae and estimate days. It identifies species precisely, because different species develop at different rates and colonize at different times. It reconstructs temperature history from meteorological records for the specific location, because development is temperature-driven and a cold week and a warm week produce very different results. It uses accumulated degree hours rather than raw elapsed time. It considers whether body was wrapped, buried, submerged or indoors, all of which change access for flies. And it states its conclusions as a minimum, not an exact figure, because what the insects can tell you is how long the remains have been available to them, which is not necessarily the same as how long the person has been dead. That distinction matters, and it is the sort of correction that only comes from a discipline being taken seriously enough to be tested. It is also worth noting the direction the other landmark technique in this case went, because the two have had very different histories. Photographic superimposition, the thing the case is famous for, has not aged as well as the insects. It remains useful for exclusion. If the skull plainly does not fit, that is informative. But as positive identification, it has been substantially displaced, first by more rigorous craniofacial analysis and ultimately by DNA. The technique that made the case famous is the one that modern courts treat with the most caution. The technique nobody remembers is the one that grew into a working discipline. There is one more group of people in this case who are almost never mentioned, and they should be. Buck Ruxton and Isabella had 3 children. They were young. In the space of a single autumn, they lost their mother, and then they lost their father twice over, once to arrest and once to execution, and the manner of both losses was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. Arrangements were made for them away from Lancaster. Their names were kept out of the subsequent literature, and by the standards of the period that was handled with more discretion than one might expect. Their later lives are not public, and it is right that they are not. Mary Rogerson's family in Morecambe had pressed for answers when the official view was that there was nothing to answer. They got the answer, which is not the same as getting anything back. It is worth naming this because the case is usually told as a scientific triumph, and it is one. Reconstruction, superimposition, and entomology all arrived at once, and the discipline was permanently changed by them. But a scientific triumph is what it looks like from the outside, at a distance of 90 years. From the inside it was 2 women dead, one because a man could not tolerate a suspicion he had invented, and one because she was in the house, and 3 children who had to be told something. So what should be taken from this? The first thing is about the nature of what Ruxton attempted, because it was more intelligent than it is usually given credit for. He did not panic. He worked through the problem of identification systematically, and he addressed every element of it that a doctor in 1935 would have known about. Fingerprints removed. Teeth removed, eyes removed, distinguishing marks removed, ears, nose, the specific features by which a face is a face removed. Judged against the forensic science of his own moment, that was close to a complete answer. He had reasoned about the problem the way an examiner reasons about a syllabus. What defeated him was that he could only address the categories of evidence that existed in his own head. He removed everything that was part of the 2 women. He could not remove the things that arrived afterwards and were nothing to do with them. The flies were not evidence when he left the ravine, they became evidence. That is the shape of this case, and it is worth naming clearly because it recurs constantly in criminal investigation. The careful offender defends against the known list changes. The second thing is about the newspaper, which is in its way the most human detail in the case. A man who had spent hours on the meticulous removal of every identifying feature from 2 bodies, then wrapped the results in a newspaper from his own town, a regional edition, printed in a run of a few thousand, effectively an address label. It is tempting to read that as stupidity. It is more useful to read it as the limits of attention. He was concentrating extremely hard on one problem, and the wrapping was not the problem, it was the thing around the problem. Almost every case in this series contains a version of that. The killer solves the difficulty he is thinking about and leaves untouched the thing he never classified as evidence at all: a ticket, a discarded cup, a receipt, a pollen grain, a stack of newspaper. The third is about Alexander Meehan's, and it is the point this channel keeps arriving at. Somebody in the autumn of 1935 was handed a quantity of maggots recovered from human remains and did not treat them as contamination. He treated them as data. He identified them, assessed their development, applied what was known about growth rates, and produced a range of days. He was a lecturer doing careful work in a laboratory. He was not a detective. He had no dramatic moment. His contribution to the case can be stated in a single sentence and takes about 10 seconds to say in a courtroom. And without it, the prosecution has an identification and a newspaper and no date, facing a defendant with a story about the relevant week and no way to be contradicted. Every episode on this channel has one of these people in it. The technician who swabbed a bite mark that could not be tested for another 23 years, the officer who logged a parking ticket, the botanist who counted seed pods. They are almost never named in the retelling because the retelling wants a detective having an idea. The fourth thing is about what the case did to the idea of what evidence is. Before 1935, the working assumption in a British investigation was that evidence came from the crime, the criminal, or the victim. It was something a person had left behind, or taken away, or been. The Ruxton case demonstrated that a crime scene continues to accumulate information after everybody has gone. The ravine kept working. Temperature, weather, insects, decay, all of it was recording, in a form nobody had thought to read. That idea is now completely standard. It is the foundation of a substantial part of modern forensic science, from decomposition studies to the analysis of soil and pollen and diatoms. In 1935, it was close to novel. And it has a consequence which is, I think, the most interesting thing in the case. There is no version of the crime Ruxton committed that could have defeated it. He could not have removed the insects because they had not arrived. He could not have prevented them, short of not depositing the remains outdoors at all. The evidence that convicted him was generated by the ravine itself, in his absence, according to rules he did not know existed. That is a genuinely different category from fingerprints or blood or fiber. Those are traces of a person. This was a process. And a process cannot be anticipated the way a trace can. You can wear gloves because gloves answer fingerprints. There is no equivalent action against a thing that begins after you leave, obeys the weather, and keeps its own record whether or not anybody ever comes to read it. The only defense would have been to know in 1935 that a man in Glasgow was interested in flies. The last point is the narrowest, and it is about how thin the margin actually was. Susan Johnson looked over a parapet. If she had not, the bundles would have stayed in a wooded gully in the Scottish borders, and the stream would have moved them, and the seasons would have gone over them. The newspaper was noticed by somebody who took the trouble to look at a wrapper. The maggots were preserved and passed to a man who happened to have an interest in a subject that had no established forensic application. None of those three things was inevitable. All of them were somebody paying attention to material that had no obvious status. Buck Ruxton removed everything by which Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson could be known, and he was efficient about it, and by the standards of the science he understood he was thorough. He was convicted because a woman stopped on a bridge, because a policeman read a wrapper, and because a lecturer in Glasgow looked at a handful of larvae and asked how old they were.